committees meeting. We have sessions on the House and Senate floors. We have everybody meeting in a little sidebar comments. So it just, we're gonna be jumping in and off. So I just want to take this moment to thank everybody for being part of this advisory panel. I think we're coming to our final meeting where we're actually going to make some recommendations that we made next week to the Executive Spark Committee. But I just want to thank everybody for your participation and your intrigue in working with this advisory panel and moving forward. I want to thank Mark for being a co-pilot and helping out. And I want to thank John. I want to thank you for facilitating all of our meetings. You did a great job. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Well, I appreciate that. And I will share any thanks to the entire support group. And there's a lot of people who've been working on this. And thank you, Representative Waymaster. Do you have any thoughts going into this, Mark, or should we dive in?
No, it's been a pleasure serving with everybody, and I'm ready to go to work. So
great. Awesome. All right. Well, let's get her done. Let's get into this. And once again, I'll thank everyone at the end once we get through all this. Once again, this is meeting number 5. This isn't necessarily going to be the last meeting. You know, there is the potential that if the Spark Executive Committee has some questions for the panel, you know, the chairs may ask the panel for any additional input on some things. The other thing to note is actually that Spark Executive Committee meeting looks like it's moving from next week to the week after due to some scheduling conflicts. So that gives a little bit more time before that session. With that being said, let's dive into it. So in terms of the overview, I will do the usual piece around providing the context of the purpose for today, where we are in the process. We're going to spend the bulk of the time really discussing and finalizing minimum and target funding envelopes for each one of the 5 program areas. In order to do that, we're going to need to get down to the idea submission level in order to evaluate that. And hopefully we've set this up in a way that makes that a fairly clear discussion for us to have. Then we're going to talk about the finalized portfolio recommendation for the Spark Committee. Walk through what that'll look like. Obviously, it's not finished because we haven't come up to all the detail of the recommendation itself, but everyone will be able to get a feel for that and be able to get their eyeballs on it, certainly, once we're able to put more of the specifics into it and then talk about the next steps. Go to the next slide. So this is the funnel that we have been talking about in terms of tracking our progress in the funnel as we've been going. And we've actually put some of the actual numbers in here in terms of starting, you know, a few months ago and kind of a really broad list of ideas, some of which came in for public submissions, a lot of which came in just due to the nature of this from various agencies and other groups. Then being able to kind of hone in our focus around some particular programmatic areas and eventually getting to the point where we're at the 5 programmatic areas we're focusing in on with some good descriptions from the panel around what each one is about, and also have gotten program parameters for how to evaluate the fit of different types of ideas and eventually projects with each one of those. And so that will allow us to be able to think about the discussion today around how to size the various programs. So that's kind of where we are in the process. Once again, just to make the point, the goal isn't just to come up with the kind of funding envelopes for each program area, but as we do that, we'll have an idea specifics of what the idea submissions are that make that up, where they exist, and those will travel from the advisory panel up to the Spark Executive Committee and continue on through the process based on what the Spark Executive Committee decides at the end of the day. Go to the next slide. I think I've talked about this on the last slide. This is just kind of the last one, kind of turned over a little bit. on its side, but the focus of this session align on the panel's priorities for minimum and target funding scenarios, define Spark recommendation with those associated ideas for each one of those. Go to the next slide. Once again, we're going to finalize the priorities for minimum and target funding scenarios, building on the idea submissions that will be included in them, and discuss the key messages for the executive committee. Go ahead. Same thing here. This kind of says the same thing again. Keep going. All right. Well, now, once again, as we're going through this, every single session, reminder of what the guiding principles are from the Spark Executive Committee, focusing on prioritizing sustainable programs of investment, so one-time use of funds. And I think everyone here is a pretty good avatar of focusing on that as we've gone through the process. Understand how these funds can combine with leverage local and agency funds. And we have, at the very least, one of our program areas that really embodies that. Foster long-term systemic impact for Kansans. And I think the panel's done a great job of really bringing that focus to this. Considering equitable opportunities and outcomes, providing the appropriate level of flexibility, and ensuring the results are measurable to enable tracking and transparency. Go to the next slide. All right, now we're going to dive into it. And this takes a little bit of setup for how we're going to kind of work the mechanics of this. So this will take a few minutes for me to kind of set the scene for everyone. Go to the next slide. So as you remember, we had the 5 program areas that the advisory panel had focused in on in the previous sessions. So if you just look at the idea submissions that are associated that with those, each one of those programmatic areas, that next column basically represents what that is. And so the total across them is $435 billion of potential funding opportunities. So in order to begin to shape this, we've looked at it in a couple different ways that can inform our discussions today. And at the end of the day, it really is just what the panel wants and the panel's judgment around this as to kind of how to approach this, that's important, that's going to come out of this. But in order to be able to provide a little bit of kind of context and pre-work for this, in the next kind of set of 2 columns, the team ended up looking at how at the idea submissions in the context of the program parameters that the advisory panels had selected. And I'll go through this in the next slides. We were able to come up with, if you're just looking at idea submissions, what a minimum and a target funding envelope could look like for each one of those program areas. Now, in the next 3 columns, it looks at this exercise from a little bit of a different, go back. It looks at it from a little bit of a different vantage point. We'll get into this part in a little more detail in a couple slides, but I want to go over it now. Is when we asked the panel to say if you could allocate 100 points across the 5 programs, here was the percentage split that came out of that. And if we said, kind of working back from an answer, if we wanted to say, well, we would want our minimum ask potentially to be around 100 million and our target or max around 150 million. If you use those percentages, those numbers in the matrix there would be the implications of what you could be targeting for each programmatic area, not necessarily what you'd want to do or not. And I think we should work through this process. This may not necessarily end up being the absolute minimum that you'd want to go forward with. This was thinking about it in the context of a $721 million overall pot. So we may need to do a little bit of rethinking about that, but hopefully the thinking that we get today from the panel will help kind of set up any future moves around kind of rethinking some of these potential funding scenarios. Go to the next slide. So, okay, so on this one, this is talking about, from an idea submission standpoint, how did these numbers come to be? And so what it looked at is, for instance, in state facilities modernization, there are $180 worth of funding ideas from the idea submissions, 15 idea submissions. And so we looked at the idea submissions, and in the minimum funding target, funding envelope, that 15 million on the side for state facilities modernization, we included ideas that met all the program parameters in the minimum funding estimate. Now, for submissions that met some, but not all of the program parameters, but scored fairly high, so they're still pretty high scoring, included those in the target. And so if there are ideas that really just didn't meet the parameters, and all that scoring has been provided, I believe, to you, and we actually can refer to it in the session if we need to. But anyway, that would be the 122 million. So that's, if you go through that exercise of tying the kind of fit of the idea submissions with the parameters for these programs that the advisory panel created, you come up with kind of an overall funding envelope of 60 to 260. A little bit of a different approach on the local safety and security equipment piece, because that would we probably have not identified the full need there in those idea submissions, because that would probably be more of a grant-based program. So needed to look at it from a few different ways there. Go to the next slide. So this is coming at it from the other angle, from the top-down angle. And, this was saying, going back to the how would you allocate 100 points across these programs exercise, and here are the results that came out with 8 people voting. And if you apply that in a very simple way to, the 5 areas, rounding up, rounding down where it makes sense, you get up, you come up with that split of 25, 40, 15, 15, 5. So directionally, it says that if you decided that you wanted to be able to focus on all 5 of the programs, and you used that kind of feedback from the advisory panel, here directionally are some targets of how the funding might break out if you had an overall $100 million target or an overall $150 million target. So part of the way that we have set up the exercise for today is saying, based on kind of the analysis around the idea submissions and where some of the natural breaks are, if we want to begin shaping towards an answer like this, what are some of the trade-offs that we need to be able to make program by program, really the advisory panels need to do. So the following slides actually walk through that exercise so that we can get, the input of this group around how to do that shaping. So hopefully that makes sense so far. Go to the next slide. We'll try it out. And we'll see kind of where we end up. Once again, this is going in to kind of complete this target ask, minimum viable ask for each one of these program areas. So go to the next slide. So this slide really is kind of the placeholder slide. That's almost like the summary for state facilities modernization. Not going to spend a lot of time on these slides at this point. You'll have a chance to kind of take one last view at these, or maybe a couple last views before they go into the recommendation to the Spark Executive Committee. We've been working, though, on making sure that we have the pieces right. So go to the next slide where we start kind of working through this exercise. So let me talk through this one, and we can try it out and see how this works. So once again, we're in state facilities modernization. And so if you look at, once again, we're working on what the minimum ask could be and what the higher level of target ask could be, and we can decide how we want to frame each one of those. It could be low end, high end, we could use other vernacular if we want to. So on this one, if you look at the that on the minimum side, that the funding scenarios based on the filtering, of things that, perfectly fit all the parameters was $15 million. But the funding scenarios based on the allocation exercise would have been 25. So there's the opportunity to say, okay, if I wanted to have more emphasis on this than just what that $15 million level implies, what else might I add in to this particular scenario on the funding for state facilities modernization that may not have quite been a perfect fit, but was kind of pretty close to get to something closer to 25 million. And so on the minimum ask side, what that says is the things that were not in scope but were pretty close was $9 million in ideas that fulfilled 2.5 of the 3 parameters. And they were things like HVAC for Kansas State schools for the deaf and blind. So if you added that 9 million back in, you get pretty close to the 25. So I guess before we get into the target ask, I'd ask people, do they get the exercise? And, and if they do, what are the thoughts around, that particular question? And I've been talking for a while, which is never a good sign. So, anyone want to lead it off in terms of thoughts around this?
I have a question. This is Joe. Where did the 100 and the 150 come from for the allocation base?
The 100 to the 150 really was partially from shaping discussions that we had with the chairs around if you had 721 million, generally where might you want to see the recommendation coming in at, what might be appropriate for, this panel. Also understanding what the appetite probably would be around this area for the Spark Executive Committee. It may not end up being perfectly 100 or 150, but it was kind of a starting point. So any thoughts on this first one?
John, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is Mike. One thing that was on my mind, when you look at the 91 million with the corrections, that's an awful lot of HVAC. And with this process, do they do any kind of energy efficiency or how old the systems they got? Or, we throw money at this. I'm sitting there saying, number one, that's a lot of money. Two, there's probably a whole lot of HVAC stuff that's going to go on in the state in the next couple of years with some of this money from different places.
Yeah, you're jumping down. You're jumping down to the target side, and we need to kind of move some out of that. But yeah, got it.
Yeah, save me for that time. That's
okay. I hear you on that because that could be a move we need to make on the subtraction side for that one potentially.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
On the minimum side, I mean, I guess I could force it just by saying, do people generally agree that we'd add in the HVAC for Kansas State schools for the deaf and blind?
John, this is Mike again. I would. I'm on Ways and Means. I took a tour of those facilities last summer, and they're needed. So I'm all in favor of that. This would be a great time to do that.
Anyone not in favor of doing that?
I would say I'm in favor of it. The nice thing about HVAC projects are their HVAC is generally kind of neglected because it doesn't show up every day and complain, if you will. The other aspect is that done correctly, as Senator Fagg says, that it can actually yield a return through energy savings.
Yeah.
And I would suspect that that would become part of the criteria that the executive committee would be looking at in
Mhm.
how they judge where they allocate the money to.
Got it. Okay. With that, I'm going to say, at least for the purposes right now, we're going to add those in to the minimum. On the target, Senator Fagg, this is where we're going to get to your point. If you just look at the idea submissions that could have fallen into that category, it's 122 million. But if you look at kind of maybe a target, based on the general kind of allocation thoughts that the panel had before, you'd be targeting something more in the $40 million range. So the question is, what would you drop off to get from 122 down to 40? And the likely suspects are there $99 million in ideas that fulfilled 3 of the 4 parameters. There is corrections HVAC. There was Museum of History HVAC, KBI Laboratory HVAC, and Judicial Center capital improvement. So, you could, drop corrections HVAC, size it down to a smaller number, and keep including everything else. What are people's thoughts about that?
My thought, John, was sizing it down. And surely they do some kind of energy efficiency in deciding which systems would be the best place to put your dollars. The other part of that says you hate to buy new ones for everybody, and then we're going to have the same problem, 20 years from now. I'd rather space that out. So if we took the worst ones right now, whatever that dollar figure is, and make that efficient and get a return on it. That was my thought. Now, whatever the magic number is, I don't know. So,
Would people include the Museum of History HVAC, KBI Laboratory HVAC, and Judicial Center capital improvements, and then just shrink down the corrections HVAC to get to that balance at 40?
So my input on the corrections HVAC is that's a little different animal as it relates to some of the criteria we're supposed to judge this against. Corrections, the HVAC systems in those are much more, they're simpler, but they're more complex because of the nature of the beast. But if these are individuals that are confined in areas where, unlike a museum or judicial center, where there's opportunities to isolate and kind of operate differently to accommodate pandemic situations and other similar things, they don't have that luxury in corrections. And I think that needs to be taken into account when the executive committee kind of takes a look at this. I know it's really hard to get excited about spending a bunch of money on correction stuff. I get that, but they do. The HVAC systems do have a different impact on those facilities than they do on a museum or laboratory. That would be, kind of the only context I'd add.
How would you want to approach that here? Would you want to stay, though, within the $40 million kind of general ballpark and say, kind of massage that correction scope appropriately?
Yeah, I think that's, about really the only thing you can do. But I guess, I get less excited about just personally throwing money at the Museum of History, HVAC, and the Judicial Center than I do about the corrections
Got it.
aspect. just because they have options to how they want to operate.
Mhm. Yep. Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
Well, I was just going to say, for the purpose of moving forward, I think we need to look at the scoring model that we have and address the ones that scored the highest out of the 3 criteria.
Mhm.
And the other thing that I would kind of like to say is the amount that was submitted obviously had a purpose behind it. If we start scaling things down, we may be ineffective because then it may not be able to do what
Yep.
they had initially said in their application. So I think
Sure.
my personal opinion would be we look at every submission at its face value
Mhm.
and either take it or leave it.
Okay.
If we start scaling things back,
Yep.
we could be allocating money that is not going to be effective at all, and then
Yep.
just
Got
totally
it.
miss the purpose of what we're doing.
Okay. So where would you want to go with this?
My personal, or I guess response to that would we take the one that actually hit the criteria. So
Okay.
right now we have the Capitol Complex, there's 2. We have the state printing plant, and we have the School for the Deaf and School for the Blind.
Yep.
That kind of hit that. And we just discuss the ones that hit the criteria and then start analyzing those applications.
So for the purposes of this, it's 24 and 24.
Right.
Got it. Okay.
So the only thing I would say, Chairman Waymaster, is that HVAC projects are scalable. And Frank can address this, but it's not one project that they would do 92 million with. I'm pretty high confident that they would have multiple projects and they could decide which ones they wanted to do if you only gave them 50.
Well, and that's my concern though, too, is I know the 92 million is multiple facilities across the state. If we start scaling it down, which ones are going to be addressed? We don't know which ones are going to be addressed. That's my concern about starting to scale the amount down from what was submitted, because I'm more than sure 92 million is for all of the correctional facilities in the state as far as HVAC. But if we cut that down to say 30 million, who's going to be addressed? We don't know that. That's my concern with scaling it back.
Mm-hmm.
John, this is Frank. My only concern there too with that 90 million is the amount of time that it takes, both in the design, the preparation, the execution, and whether that's really feasible within the time limits that we've established for spending those funds. Because to my knowledge, there hasn't been pre-planning design. This isn't an off-the-shelf thing that they had prepared for. And I think personally, projects that have maybe put it in their 5-year plan, that have vetted it, that have designed, but they've been lacking funding, ought to take precedence over those that here's some free money. Now let's figure out how to execute it.
Well, let me ask you just one last time. Would the Museum of History, KBI Laboratory, or Judicial Center capital improvement fall into that particular bucket or not?
When you're talking in just an air handler replacement, a piece of equipment, you're not talking about all the additional life safety. When you're adding something like air conditioning into an un-air conditioned facility, and especially an occupied facility, it's much more complex. I'm not sure where that budget number came from or how they come to that number, frankly. I do know that the Museum of History had been looking at air handler replacement and HVAC upgrades. I'm probably less familiar with the KBI. But I suspect it would have been in their capital improvement plans or their 5-year plan as a need that needed to be addressed.
So would that argue towards you might want to include those in this or not? Just 24.
Right. I mean, I frankly, I can only speak to the projects that the D of A has submitted on, like the print plant. We spent a substantial amount of time with an engineering consultant doing all the assessments of the deficiencies. And the legwork's been done. The project's ready to go, maybe not necessarily designed,
Okay.
But there was pre-planning involved, same thing on air handlers in the Capitol complex. It's something we intend to do. It's just going to take us many, many years.
Okay.
So that's kind of where I'm
Right.
at with pre-planning of projects and execution.
Well, we'll go with 24 then, unless I hear any objections. No objections. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Okay, one other thing is this is starting to kind of look from a format standpoint in terms of, and we need to have a little bit of consistency across the panels as the Spark Executive Committee sees what's coming up in terms of the recommendations. So this is kind of getting at the rationale, the impact, the feasibility, the recommendations. We obviously need to update this based on what was selected. But we'll let people kind of look at this at their leisure afterwards and provide any commentary around it. But this was just kind of how we're starting to kind of build the story that the chairs, and the chairs will be able to modify this as they see fit. But, when the chairs make their recommendations to the Spark Executive Committee in a couple of weeks, this would be one thing that would go along with it to provide a little context. Go to the next slide. All right, so here's the running list of where we are. We're going to continue to add these up as we go, so we kind of know where we're tracking. So we're going to do state IT infrastructure next. Once again, more of a placeholder slide. Go to the next. All right, so on the minimum side here, if you looked at the funding scenarios based on, there are $16 million worth of idea submissions that fit all of the parameters that have been put forward. Now, if you wanted to, add, because just based on the allocation exercise previously, the things that are around that size that, weren't in scope there were $32 million in ideas that fulfilled 3.5 of the 4 parameters. And those were the 2 big ones were the OITS cybersecurity and the UI system modernization. So before we move on, people's thoughts on whether to add either, both, or neither of those into that minimum scenario.
I think the cybersecurity is pretty high on my list, so I'd vote to add that. I wouldn't support the UI modernization.
John, I second Mark as well on that.
All right, anyone disagree? We didn't hear what you just said, Representative Waymaster.
I said, no, I agree with that. I agree with
Okay,
Mark.
great. All right. So unless I hear anything from anyone, we're going to add back the OITS cybersecurity at 12, and we're at 28. On the target, there's based on kind of where the breaks were in that idea submission rating exercise, it'd be 71 million. But, so if we wanted to target something lower in the 60 million or below range, the types of things that would be kind of the next tranche that could fall out, there was $23 million worth of things that fulfilled 3 of the 4 parameters. What fell in there were judicial tech upgrades, data warehouse, single sign-on implementation, and workflow automation. So I guess, once again, feedback on that. Would people just drop the entire category, or are there some things in particular here that people would want to keep in?
John, there were 2 type of single sign-on submissions. I think one was for constituents and one was for state employees. Do we know which one this is, or is it just combined all together? I'm sorry, I can flip over to the other screen, but I only have one screen available to me.
I'll have to ask the support team if you have a handle on that one.
This is the constituency single sign-on initiative.
Great, thank you very much. John, if with that clarification, I would be inclined to add the single
Okay.
sign-on implementation, simply because
Okay.
it's also a piggyback off of the overall cybersecurity initiatives that the government has taken.
Got it.
Thank you.
Anyone else advocate for any of the other three, or?
I'm going to admit that I'm somewhat at a handicap here, is that some of these, it's been a while since I've read the descriptions on them. But so I'll be deferring to the experts,
Got
Tanya.
it.
So,
Yeah, I'm in the same position. I'm trying to look them up right now. Sorry.
Yep.
I mean, John, the data warehouse element is, somewhat important because the creation of that will allow for centralized data sharing between, the agencies. I mean, yeah, it's a multiple year type of project, but it is one that would help establish what I like to call a consolidated system of record, right?
Okay,
For all the data that's collected. So
Yep.
I would be inclined to also add that one in as well, but not at the jeopardy of the other ones that we have already
Okay.
determined.
the one question I have on that, Tanya, would that have any ongoing costs associated with that?
As a matter of fact, we might actually gain a cost savings once you start consolidating and bringing, disparate systems and data sets together. You might be able to deprecate the duplicate systems. So over time, there'll probably be an initial, CapEx cost that you're to stand it up, and then as you start quantifying and verifying the integrity of the data, moved over, you can then start deprecating the older systems.
Yeah.
So you could save probably from a technology cost perspective, and potentially if you were looking at it, let's say from a physical data center perspective, you might be able to get back some, leasing footprint.
Okay.
All right. So we've heard advocating for the data warehouse and single sign-on implementation. Anyone have any thoughts otherwise?
John, I'm sorry to get you off track here again. On that UI that Mark talked about, that $20 million,
Yes,
was he not in favor of that, Mark, was you, or not?
he was not.
Okay, here's my question. Maybe Chairman Waymaster can ask. I'm shocked that that's not taken care of, because there was a bunch of money spent on that last year. And if we're still $20 million short, this would probably be the time to address that. And it's also those parameters, that's 3.5, that's a high rated one for us too. So I just wanted to see what the chairman thought about that.
And we did, and actually, I've had a meeting with the Department of Labor, and we talked about the money that we put into the unemployment system on the state level. There's been a contracting issue in the I guess basically all the RFP process. So there's been an issue there. I think this is something that we need more information on. And I think this needs actually to be either a matter that's handled through the State Finance Council, or it's a matter that's handled through the legislature. Because there has been some issues beyond the money that we gave last year in regards to the contracting process.
Yeah. And we checked as a support team, the 20 million is a still incremental need, right? But it sounded like some of the questions that were in place were just the efficiency of the spend, I guess.
Right.
Got it.
Okay, thank you.
So what I'm hearing in particular about here, data warehouse and single sign-on implementation. Those are the things definitely want in here, right?
I'm good with that.
So what does that make the target number? Because there are some other things, were there some other things then that since we moved from we kept would that end up making it just 8 million over 28 million? Someone on the support team help me understand what's in the 56 million. Okay. So it had brought a few other things in. Yep. Okay. That were a little bit higher than the 3 out of 4, the 3.5s. Okay. All right. Okay. Keep going. Once again, you guys can look at this in terms of, later, we're going to continue to refine these slides, but go to the next one. All right, here's our running total. So let's go to the next one, state continuity of operations. Next slide. And on these ones, we're getting into a lot smaller buckets on these, right? So if we looked at in the minimum ask of things that perfectly fit around this, there were $2 million worth of items. If you wanted to get up to force yourself up to a $15 million, things that weren't in scope on the minimum side were 26 million in ideas that fulfill 2.5 out of 3 parameters. And the big one there is the public broadcasting equipment modernization. So, I mean, I guess that's the one element we're thinking of here of would we add that in beyond the $2 million of idea submissions that kind of perfectly fit the parameters.
Well, what were the things that were at 2, since there's only one really big chunk there that was at 2.5?
Yeah, what was it 2?
Looks like it's a lot from the KBI and then Department of Labor for call center phone system.
So I mean, it sounds to me like on the minimum, it's either keep it at 2 or make it 28.
I would too.
I would advocate for the 28. And the reason why I say that is because I think in the application, I don't think they were very specific, but we did talk about this in a previous meeting, that the public broadcasting stations across the state during the COVID pandemic basically worked with the Kansas Department of Education and having educational items on the airwaves, or they provided some services through all the schools in the state of Kansas during the pandemic. Their equipment is needing to be upgraded. It's been over 20 years since they've had an upgrade on some of their facilities throughout the entire state. And because of the fact of the partnership that they had with the Kansas Department of Education in regards to educating the kids across the state of Kansas and the need for the upgrades, I would ask for the 28.
That's a good perspective, Mr. Chair. I'll support you on that.
Thank you, Mark.
All right, let's go with the 28. So I guess the question in terms of the target would be if you just want to stick with the 28, or what was that incremental piece? What were some of the pieces beyond this 28 that would have taken it to 32? Is it that $4 million of Kansas Wild?
Yes, yes, the Kansas Wildland firefighting equipment, that's specifically a grant for equipment, KBI laboratory equipment and operating supplies as well.
So I guess the question is, do you want to actually add one, both, or neither of those in, which would raise the target above 28, or just leave it at 28?
So I guess my question is, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how, I guess I'll just have to trust you that the wildfire fighting equipment qualifies. I definitely think, given the tendency we've had lately for wildfires trying to burn Russell down, where I think we ought to be pretty serious about putting that in.
Anyone second that?
I second it.
I agree with Mark too.
Okay, well, let's add that one back. This is where it helped being frugal in the earlier ones.
I can explain maybe the reinstatement fee fund there a little bit. That's based on the lack of activity around driver's license reinstatements during COVID.
Mhm.
That fee fund is based on the reinstatement of driver's licenses. And when during COVID, the decision was made to not reinstate driver's licenses on the regular using the regular process. Fee funds that were reliant on those were hit pretty hard, and those are operational funds,
Mhm.
and that's what that is about.
Do people want to add that in or not?
I was going to ask Joe, will that catch up though? I mean, as people kind of re-engage, do you anticipate those funds will catch up?
My
They
understanding
lost
is,
forever.
yeah, my understanding is that those were deferments, and there isn't a catch up there, that the reinstatements were just deferred, and that there isn't an expectation that people that were due, say, a year ago, are going to have to, like, there's not going to be a big rush of reinstatements that were due a year ago to be done now. But that's, I'd have to defer to revenue on that. I'm not sure what the plan is.
Final summary before the final.
Well, I guess for me, it's not a huge amount, so I'm not sure it's a mountain to die on. But I think philosophically, I personally have kind of tried to stay away from kind of fixing problems like that going forward, because I'm just not sure how that's going to work. But I'd certainly defer to the rest of the committee on it and get some other input. I take it you'd want to put it in, Joe.
Well, yeah, and I need to correct myself there. This is a different fee fund. This is based on the court closures, not on revenue. So this
Just on
reinstatement,
court.
yeah, this is the reinstatement fee for people that are getting their driver's licenses reinstated through court process. And since the courts were closed, those didn't occur.
Yeah, I'm even less excited about that one, to be honest with you.
So anyone, I guess for now, what's the call? Yes or no?
Senator, what are you thinking on that one?
I'm thinking that our chairman Waymaster can take care of that in the budget.
Okay, I'd kind of agree.
Okay.
Question back on the firefighter grant. I'm reading the description. This seems to be for compensation to pay local fire departments for their time and efforts, is the way I'm reading this.
On the equipment grant?
Going back, looking at EMO 11, providing financial aid to the departments and the state to invest in safe. The way I describe that, it's more of a compensation to offset cost.
That would change my mind.
Okay.
I think we might want clarity on that.
Just to clarify, in the submissions, this is submission ID EM011.
Correct.
This is the wildland firefighting grant. The description does say funds would be used for the replacement of equipment or fire apparatus that was destroyed or damaged in large wildland fires, as well as equipment that is minimally functioning or non-operational, outdated, or unsafe.
I think it goes on to say will not be used for apparatus equipment that's destroyed under fire or covered by insurance or other means as well. So my question, if this is approved, this is like as needed if there was an event where we're allocating money up front. How does that get spent or used in the leading up to an incident?
So this is the way you understand it, Frank, is it's kind of waiting for the next event. It doesn't look back and compensate fire departments for equipment that was damaged or destroyed in wildfires.
Yeah, the first sentence says request funds to fund, support volunteer part-time departments across Kansas for no match funds. So I guess I'm just unclear as to, are we purchasing something or are we setting aside money?
So John,
Future event.
can we qualify this in a way that it's clear that it's just to be spent on replacement equipment that wasn't covered by insurance, as well as purchase of additional equipment that's needed to fight wildfires?
Yeah, I think so, sure.
And I guess my follow-up, if an emergency declaration was declared due to a natural emergency like a fire, does that trigger a whole separate set of funding that would also address these same issues? I don't know.
Yeah, I have no idea on that.
Yeah, I think we can qualify it. I don't know the answer to the second one.
Would you be okay with putting it in for now, Frank, and let
Mhm.
them, maybe we could footnote it so that the
Yep.
the committee could
Here's the
could
intent.
ferret that out? Yeah. Okay,
Yeah, would agree.
let's do that. Troy's on the floor voting, I'm guessing, so.
Okay.
We'll put
I've
it
I've gotten a request from the support team to go back to the IT one just to make sure we're very clear on what's in and what's out on the two scenarios. So if you want to go back to that, let's go. Why don't you ask the specific questions around those in terms of where your question marks are between the two?
Yep, happy to. Just want to confirm that judicial tech upgrade in the bottom right-hand corner, judicial tech upgrades and workflow automation are not intended to be included in the target ask.
That was my intention, that they would not
Yeah.
be included.
That was my understanding of where the group came out.
Thank
Mine
you.
as well.
One more clarifying question. The UI modernization, $20 million, scored 3.5 out of 4. And so would be included in the target ask based on its performance against the parameters. Do we want to remove it from the target ask?
I believe so, based on the discussion we had.
Okay, so that takes it down to 36.
Correct.
Yep.
Then you have other idea submissions that performed at 3.5 that are included in the target
Yeah.
ask, such as cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification.
Great. Awesome. Well, let's see the summary one again now, where you get does Jerry Lewis say the Tiffany? All right. So let's go to state safety and security equipment. Next slide. All right, so on the minimum, looking at the filtering, it's at 19 million, and kind of the allocation would drop it. Could drop it more if we want to too, but currently in scope is that whole 19 million of ideas that fulfilled 3 out of 3 parameters. And they were the KHP law enforcement radio modernization at 18 million, KBI vehicle mounted radio replacement at 0.5, and KBI handheld radio replacement at 0.3. So any moves that people want to make here around the minimum?
I guess I had a question here on the Wildlife and Parks Radio. I assume it's their gaming enforcement agents. I'm not sure how you can get a 0.5 if it's categorized as a federal requirement or not. It either is or it isn't. So why would we distinguish, or what decision led to knocking that one down when everyone else was a 1?
It's a great question. I had the same question.
Any thoughts?
So this one was for park rangers, and the parameter that it scored half on was required for federal compliance. Unlike the KBI requirements and the patrol law enforcement radio need, it was a little bit unclear around whether it was truly required for federal compliance.
I guess my opinion, they're putting themselves at risk too, usually in an unsafe area or remote area. And for us to make that determination, not knowing the circumstances when they're the only group that was left out, I have a hard time with that one.
How large was that particular one?
What
What
is
was
the
the
number?
dollar amount on that? Ask.
0.75 million.
A million.
What's the number?
0.75 million.
This is submission EM 108.
Thank you.
Do you want to include it here? And we'll say if we find that it isn't required, then we'll exclude it, but, you know, do a little bit of kind of research there.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of align with Frank on that. I mean, they're out there, they're law enforcement just like everybody else, and,
Yep.
and frankly, they're in tougher situations sometimes. So
Yep, okay.
I'd support adding that.
So that makes this minimum almost 20 million, right?
Yeah.
Yes, so that would bring this up to 20 million. And just to clarify, the panel is completely welcome to change the values in terms of the parameters. If the panel believes that it should be scored a 1 for federal compliance, that is up to the panel.
Yeah, we could check on that too, but it sounds like for the intent, we're saying if it's a question, given the similarity, we may want to kind of treat it equally.
Mhm.
Okay. So would it go without saying that we're going to end up at the minimum and the target here, 20?
I think so.
Okay.
Great.
Before we get too far down the road, Joe was asking if we go back and consider electronic records for DCF.
Well, I was going to do that. Let's get to the 5th one and then let's revisit where everything stands and we can
Okay.
kind of look at any kind of
All right, I just didn't want that.
any holistic views.
I didn't want that to drop through a crack.
Okay. Got it. Well, I promise, Joe, we'll get back to that one and talk about it at the end. Go to the next one. Okay, keep going. So this is where we're standing now. Okay. Go to local safety and security equipment. So this is, you know, it's at 8 million on the filtering. If you wanted to take it down, so this one's built differently, right? And this one's saying, since this would be more of a grant program, because the idea submissions aren't kind of, they're isolated submissions and not indicative if you went out with a grant program. So the thought would be that, $8 million, if you size it that way, would cover 1/3 of Kansas counties at $0.18 million per award. The one thing about this is, I'm not sure that this took into account any matching requirements. But so the 8 and the 14 were basically just sized based on an estimate. That was an informed estimate. And in one case, it was 1/3 of counties, and in the higher case, it was 2/3 of counties. So I guess the question is, how do you want to approach this?
So are we gonna recommend the match or leave that up to the executive committee?
I think if the advisory panel thinks there should be a match, then you should say there should be a match.
But do we recommend a 2-to-1 or 1-to-1 or just leave that up to them? Don't know that that's a big deal, but
I think if you say I think you should definitely specify if you think there should be a match. in terms of the amounts, I guess you could leave it up to them unless you felt you had more specific knowledge here that might drive the match number.
So, I mean, I'm torn on this one. I think this is really kind of set up to essentially, it's going to be really hard to parse out, how the grants are going to go. I guess that's somebody else's problem. But, but I'm weigh that against, we're talking local safety and security. And I don't think anybody argues that we don't want to do everything we can for that. So I don't know. I mean, I'm okay with leaving it at 5 and 10, but love to have, everybody else's input.
Is there, maybe this is something someone from the recovery office can ask, is it reasonable or feasible to base this on the population classifications of frontier, rural, urban, and then to base also a gradated match requirement on those classifications? So we could say, instead of just using numbers like 1/3 and 2/3, as I think about this, I think, there's 105 counties in the state. Some of those counties have plenty of budget to cover this, and they're not going to ask, and they're not going to want it because they don't need it. They've probably already got it in their budget and they're moving on. But some counties, they have, 3 guys on a force to cover the entire county on a 24/7 schedule, and they don't have enough budget to buy ammunition for their weapons. And those agencies might need more help. So how do we account for that, right? And I think maybe that's what Mark's getting at. I don't know how feasible that is. So maybe is there somebody at the recovery office on the call that can maybe speak to the feasibility of trying to set something like that up before we try to go down that road?
Hi, Joe. Yeah, this is Ethan Belshie with the Office of Recovery. I think without knowing who the ultimate administering entity would be for this program, it's hard to say, but I think it's certainly within the advisory panel's purview to include that as part of the recommendation.
I guess one thought would be you could size it at the 8 and 14 as opposed to the 5 and 10 and say, if people don't apply for the funds, they don't get the funds. There may be some requirements around the parameters of what it takes to be able to get the funds.
Yeah. Well, I think I definitely don't want to do something that just starts sending money out that haven't asked for. So
there needs to be a demonstrated need.
Yeah.
And this is Andrea, also from the recovery office. And I think you can make a recommendation that funding is based, just as you said, John, on a demonstrated need. And then, that's something that can be, what that means can be worked out down the road. I don't know that we have the information to be able to make those kind of determinations at this point, like what would be the best indicator of need. But you can certainly make those recommendations.
I like kind of where Joe was going. And so I think it needs to be based on evidence of need and with an emphasis or a proclivity to economically disadvantaged counties.
Got it. Do we want to put in, once again, do we want to put in the placeholders of 8 and 14 and saying that it may be that it ends up only being 5, but
I think 5 and 10 is
5 and 10.
probably,
Okay.
that's probably about as good as it's going to get.
Okay. Anyone disagree with 5 and 10? and we'll make
What
the
were
changes
what were
on the
the
parameters.
numbers on the actual ask, independent of everything else?
The local submissions that were in scope for the minimum ask, as in they met all three parameters, including local indication that they would be able to do local match, was around 4 million. For all submissions received, that number is around 7 million.
Yeah.
Thank
So this at least covers that.
Yeah. Where are we
Okay.
going?
Well, let's go back to the summary and just kind of see where we stand right now. Anyone want to forward it to the?
Yes, 1 second, working on it.
All right. So here's where we stand. In terms of the minimum ask, we're at around 105, which is pretty close. In terms of the target ask, we're at 121, which is under, that 100 to 150 envelope. So I guess the question at this point is, are there any things that people would want to kind of advocate for, Joe?
Yeah, I was looking at the list of requests under the state IT infrastructure, and without dipping really far down into the list of requests in terms of their score on the parameter, I noticed the children and family electronic records request, which was at a 2.5 under the parameters. And that and it's a $10 million ask. But that resonated with me because for several years there has been a lot of discussion and talk and attempt to improve information sharing between DCF and law enforcement, the criminal justice and public safety folks generally. That has been in large part held up because DCF's records are significantly paper. And there is an inability to effectively share information in cases where there are neglected or abused children, and DCF may know about it, but public safety may not. And that is a significant issue that is difficult to overcome, requires manual, right now, manual telephone calls, somebody physically looking something up at an agency where they're 8 to 5. It's difficult to get somebody on the weekend, and so on and so forth. I think this speaks to some of the initiative parameters that we had been talking about interoperability and the ability for us to increase efficiency in government generally, and directly serving citizens of the state. Some of the most disadvantaged citizens of the state include children that are being victimized. So I think this fits a lot of our parameters overall across the board, and I would say that it's something that we ought to at least take another look at.
So are you advocating for putting it probably in the target ask?
Yes, I am.
I'd support that. This actually came from me, from an experience that our one of our children, they participate in the foster parent program, and it's an immense sense of frustration, I think, across the board, that they're still carrying records in 3-ring binders on these kids. And a security issue, it's a intercommunication issue. It really is something. I was surprised that it was at that level in today's world, frankly.
Anyone? Sounds like we have a motion and a seconding. Anyone disagree?
I see Chair Waymaster's back, so I'll yield the chair to him and see what he thinks.
Well, and I agree with the motion. I mean, we have been probably needing to modernize many systems across the state, but I think in the foster care system with DCF, that is something that I think would be easier for our caseworkers if we would modernize and have tablets instead of books and binders. So I'm in favor of the motion.
All right, so let's change, let's add the additional amount into the target ask on state IT infrastructure. All right, so here's where we stand at the summary level, a little bit over from the 100 on the minimum ask side, 105, a decent amount under, which isn't a bad thing, let's say, around the target ask side. I guess I'd ask people now at kind of a summary level, given what we just went through, how are people feeling, with this in terms of the decisions made around the funding envelopes for each one of these and where it came out total and what's included and excluded? People feel good? People have concerns?
I guess I would ask the chairs, considering that the 100 to 150 came from what they consider maybe realistic, whether this is still in that ballpark.
Well, I would thank you, Joe. I would say I think it's within that ballpark, and I'm pretty pleased where the numbers are at, because the quagmire that Mark and I are going to be in when we go in front of the Spark Executive Committee is we don't want to ask too much, we don't want to ask too little. So we want to be right in that area where I think right now for our target ask, I think we're right there. And the reason why we had chosen the 100 and 150 million is because looking at the money that is remaining, our assumption was that more would go towards economic revitalization, because that's what's happened in the past and history has a tendency to repeat itself. So that's why we decided to have our area of requests anywhere from 100 to 150 million. But I'm pleased with where we're at right now. I'll turn it over to Mark and see if he has any additional comments.
I align I'm really pleased with where this came out. I thought it was going to be harder to kind of stay too, frankly. So I think we ought to quit while we're ahead.
Okay. Great. Well, and you guys are kind of rock stars as a group in terms of walking through this. Let's keep going. Were we supposed to take kind of like a 5-minute break before kind of looking forward? Yeah, 5-minute break, and then it probably won't take as much time to kind of walk through structurally what the recommendation will look like. But let's come back at like 5:17, and then we'll kind of move on. Thanks. All right, let's get back in about a minute or so. All right, well, let's get started again. Go to the next slide. So the next slide basically lays out kind of a beginner kind of format of what the recommendation could look like. We're going to need to continue to work through the details, obviously incorporating what we came up with today, as well as the format with the chairs who will be presenting it in a couple weeks to the Spark Executive Committee. But just to give everyone kind of a view of what it could look like, at least some of our thoughts around it at this point in time, wanted to go through a few slides just to give everyone a heads up. We'll make sure that we share this with everyone so that they can provide kind of more comments at their leisure as well. So go to the next slide. So the executive committee is going to be able to see the portfolio recommendation summary, as well as some program reports, that are kind of detailed offline review. So there's going to be like appendix material and then kind of the core part of the presentation. We're really going through kind of the core part of the presentation here, but the intent is for the Spark Executive Committee to be able to see kind of all the breadcrumbs of what the process that the panel worked through. So go to the next slide. And once again, this will evolve for sure, because we haven't even really walked through this with the chairs at this point. Go to the next slide. So at the summary, it's really just kind of putting in place kind of a high level situation assessment around, the state of play around what this advisory panel was looking at. And so this is referring back to some of the things that we talked about as context setting at the start of the effort. Go to the next slide. Once again, we don't need a wordsmith here because we're going to reflect everyone's views, as we pull this together. This was the process that we worked through in terms of the situation analysis, brainstorm, program development, prioritization, portfolio sizing, and then the executive committee recommendation. Next slide. Here's who's on the committee. Frank and Matt, if you want to provide pictures, we will put pictures of you guys in. Next slide. This is talking about, in terms of the proposed portfolio, really identifying the 5 programs and what opportunities they linked up against. Next slide. And this is getting at here is the minimum ask overall and the target ask overall, and then by each one of those areas, and kind of defining what some of the key points were in each one of those program areas in terms of the types of things that were put in there. Next slide. Then there will be lists of the specific idea submissions, and we're going to need to show what's in the minimum versus the target in each one of these so that people know, kind of what's included from an idea submission standpoint. Next slide. And at a high level, this is kind of a little bit the selling piece around each one of these areas in terms of alignment to the guiding principles, impact, feasibility at a high level, how to think about each one of these. And this is some things to just kind of help the Spark Executive Committee think about these. We may move some of these ratings around. We'll get your input and the executive and the chair's input as we go forward. Next slide. And this is a little bit more of a description around, what's behind some of those scores. We may not need necessarily both of those slides, but this is just kind of a further level of elaboration. This is almost kind of like a stoplight, so that, the Spark Executive Committee can kind of see, how to think about these areas. Next slide. And then this is the summary, kind of the closing around the ask, around, specific dollar amounts for each one of the areas. And once again, there will be program templates, there will be all the idea submission info, there will be how they scored, all that stuff is going to be in the appendix, so not in the, and there will be a pre-read that gets sent out to the Spark Executive Committee. So they'll see what they're going to hear in terms of the presentation, plus get the background information as well. Next slide. So in terms of the next steps, go to the next slide. The one point I'd make is this is officially, the fifth and final meeting, but we will continue looking for input on the materials as we continue to finalize them. And then when Mark and Representative Waymaster present on, and now it looks like the date's the 15th, to the Spark Executive Committee, there may be questions that come back or ask clarifications or anything like that. And so if that's the case, Mark and Representative Waymaster may decide to bring the group back together. It'll be their call. So this may not be the last time that this group is tapped on. I'd actually say it's become a pretty high performing team, actually. So, pretty valuable getting everyone here's input. But this is kind of the general kind of lay of the timeline around being able to get across all the four panels, the chairs presenting the recommendations in the middle of April, with the hope that by late April, early May, the Spark Executive Committee is going to be able to make some of those integrated decisions around where to go with the overall set of funds and start structuring that recommendation to kind of flow to the State Finance Council for approval.
John, did you say that the 15th to the 18th is going to slip to the following week?
No, we'd originally had the 7th, I believe, for connectivity and efficiency and modernization. That has moved to the 15th.
All right.
So, yeah.
Just want to.
Yep. So that's the general flow. Like I said, this hasn't been finalized yet in terms of the exact kind of what would be shown, the approach and how to do it. We need to get a lot of input. We'll get this out so people can take a look at it and we can make sure we're portraying things correctly. And Mark and Representative Waymaster, obviously, we're going to work closely with you on that. But just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a flavor for what it could look like. So I guess with that, any questions or thoughts, on the second half of kind of what I just went through?
I think it pretty well sums up what we've been doing and where we ended up. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. And the team flip forward to say there's an optional homework, review the detailed program reports, provide input. We're going to get the email out, but just kind of continuing to make sure everyone gets their eyeballs on the materials that will go forward in terms of.
Is that extra credit homework?
That could be extra credit homework. Yeah. The support team will send out gold stars on that one.
Well, I thought Waymaster would do that.
Okay. All right.
I do what, Mark?
Since there's an
Send out
option.
a star for everybody who did their extra credit homework.
Oh, okay. I can do that.
Okay. All right. So with that, any additional thoughts, comments, anything from the chairs? I will say from my standpoint, it's been a pleasure working with all of you. You've been a great team to work with, and I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Question, how are agencies notified if their request did not make the criteria? The reason I mention it is because they're going to use existing fiscal year 23 funds. They have a June cutoff date, which the state starts shutting down the procurement. When will they be notified they did not make that list?
It's not going to be finalized until the Spark Executive Committee decides. I mean, I guess, and I leave this up to Representative Waymaster, if we say on a preliminary basis, it looks like here's what's included and here's what's not included, we could almost do that now, right? With the knowledge, though, that the Spark Executive Committee could take things out or could add things back, right? But it would give them a directional view. I don't know how you want to approach that.
Well, and the other thing is, I mean, that the Spark Executive Committee could take things out or add things, and so could the State Finance Council. So
Yeah.
it just kind of depends how the agencies and departments are on getting these items if they look to those other two groups to try to get those added. And then probably I would say nothing would be sent to the agencies or the departments until it's actually finalized by the State Finance Council, because then it's done.
Yep. Any other thoughts, comments?
The only thing I was going to say is I want to commend the group for doing a great job. Like Mark mentioned earlier, it was easier than we thought it was going to be. Having the filters and the scoring. I mean, that really, I think, was for this advisory panel efficient. And we were able to get through those items rather quickly. And so I just want to commend the group and everybody's input and expertise. And then again, I want to thank John for facilitating this.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I agree. This process started out a little abstract for me and came together very well, John. So thank you.
Well, thanks. Like I said, there are a lot of folks, both from the support team, recovery office, CalRD, that have really supported this. So they all deserve, a lot of thank you as well. So thanks. Great. Well, thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.